Max is a rock climber and a route setter for climbing competitions, where he has designed problems for a lot of major competitions, including the World Bouldering Cup. I first became aware of Max's work when I read a big profile of him in Outside magazine. And I knew instantly that I wanted to invite Max to speak at practice, because here was the kind of game design that is out there existing in the world, kind of unrecognized as part of our shared discipline, but bearing every indication of being really deeply connected to the kind of work that we do, those of us who are video game designers, computer game designers, board game designers. This was so interesting to me to see Max talk about his work in terms of the aesthetics of the experiences that he was trying to create, and then working backwards through thinking about how he wanted people to experience that directly in terms of the motion of their bodies, and then working backwards to the mechanics of actually just placing holds on a wall, and really thinking and like wrestling with all of this, the problems that we recognize as game designers, but doing so in this like supremely kind of interesting minimalist domain of the human body and the physics that determine what it can and can't do. I just found it beautiful. I think rock climbing is really interesting. It's so full of interesting contrasts. The mind and the body, you know, that these things are that we think of as being separate domains because of Cartesian dualism or whatever it is. We have these instincts that over here we have the mind, and it's just like this diaphanous, pure, free-floating thing, and then over here we have the world with its objects, and I think in rock climbing you see that dichotomy just like thrown into a blender, and you recognize the places where the mind and the body kind of coexist, and I think that's something that really game design is so good at bringing out. It's almost like a particle accelerator that causes us to like really zoom into that thing that we, the space between those things, and see how they're really conjoined. So and so I think Max is really on the forefront of the people who are thinking about climbing in this way, the way that we think about the games and game design, and so I'm really excited to hear him share his process and see how he thinks. So please join me in welcoming Max Zolotukhin.
Am I talking to this thing? Yeah, cool. Hi. So I've never done anything even remotely like this, so bear with me. I'm pretty nervous. But how many of you? Oh, whoa. Jeez.
Right off the bat.
It's okay. Come on.
Woo! All right. How many of you guys have been to a climbing gym before? Okay, great. Climbing is one of the most innate challenges that man has ever undertaken. When asked why he wanted to climb Mount Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary simply stated, because it's there. It's hard to explain why it feels good to stand on top of a mountain or a wall or a boulder. Perhaps it's the perfect allegory for achieving a preset goal. What I do know is that it's more fun to go to the climbing gym with your friends than it is to drag a giant car tire behind you with a chain or do a bunch of sit-ups. Indoor climbing is one of the only workouts that I can think of that's both a social activity and also just naturally really fun. To me, the fact that you can shoot the shit with your buddies while you try to figure out the same tricky climb is what is at the heart of what makes climbing special. I see this all the time. Two random people are climbing alone and start to connect over a shared challenge. This is categorically different than two surfers fighting over the same wave or two basketball players trying to get one ball into the same hoop. To these climbers, when one of them succeeds, it serves to inform and inspire the other to do the same. I'm not here to sell you guys on rock climbing, but I do want to share with you some insight into the lives of a group of misfits, dirtbags, college dropouts, and dreamers who've been largely responsible for the exponential growth of the indoor climbing industry in the 21st century. This is a bit cheesy, but bear with me. So, these occupations have hardly anything in common, but if you combine their skill sets and sprinkle in a little nonconformity, a little nerd culture, and a little free-spiritedness, you get these guys. They and myself are route setters. Our jobs is to bolt and screw holds and features onto climbing walls and create movement. So what is route setting? Route setting is a highly specialized trade. While some folks do it recreationally on home walls or part-time at smaller gyms, full-time commercial setters work 40 hours a week creating fresh routes and boulder problems for gym members and guests. Do you guys know the difference between routes and boulder problems? No? Okay, so a route is something that you tie into a rope to climb, so it's usually taller than 20 feet. And a boulder problem is something that you climb without a rope, usually somewhere in the 10 to up to 20 feet range, but then there's a whole bunch of crash pads on the ground. So when you fall, you hit pads, most of the time you're safe. Think of us like the chefs behind the kitchen door of a restaurant. You might not see us behind the scenes, but the flavor and the presentation are the reasons that you keep coming back. On a daily basis, a crew of commercial route setters is responsible for stripping entire sections of the climbing gym, washing all the holds from the old ones, then setting all new routes in their place, and finally climbing them to make sure that they're up to the gym standards. So, in 2009, CNN put out one of these little clickbait articles that was like 10 jobs that are cooler than yours, and route setter happened to be on the list, sandwiched between pet psychologist and shoe designer. So, yeah. And the funniest thing about this to me was that it was the only one of the 10 that the average annual salary was unknown. So basically, route setting, it's a classical example of a passion pay profession. Most setters are not paid anywhere near commensurate with their incredibly diverse and specialized skill sets. All right, so let's rewind a little bit.
This is sport climbing, a relatively new athletic challenge with roots in rock climbing and mountaineering. In sport climbing, the course is a man-made wall, 120 feet high. Men and women climbers compete using only their skill, determination, and safety ropes in this unique combination of endurance and...
So brace yourselves, this is pretty extreme. Can't believe that Red Bull hasn't really made a commercial out of this footage. But this is the wide world of sports. This was in Snowbird, Utah in 1988, and it was like the first international sport climbing championship. For many people, this was, as it is for you now, it might be your first time seeing rock climbing on TV in front of you. So, it was only a couple of years earlier that the first two commercial climbing gyms in the U.S. opened. Vertical World in Seattle, Washington, and the Boston Rock Gym in Woburn, Mass. These gyms were dirty old warehouses with real chunks of rock glued to the wall. This is pretty crazy. These are actually old shredded tires that are on the ground. So fast forward 30 years, climbing gyms have transformed into upscale multi-use fitness facilities. The gym chains behind them have turned into lucrative franchises, opening multi-mega gyms in major metropolitan areas. In fact, one highly visible gym chain, this one, Brooklyn Boulders, was recently bought by an investment firm for $49 million. This is a previously unheard of number in the climbing industry. As indoor climbing gyms evolved, climbing competitions followed suit. You guys get the idea.
Is that your work?
I don't think any of those, no, because that's from 2014. No, unfortunately, but I'll show you a little bit in a bit. USA Climbing, our national governing body of competitive climbing, currently sanctions nearly 100 climbing competitions annually, and the International Federation of Sport Climbing has just had its bid accepted for inclusion as a provisional sport in the Tokyo Olympics in 2020. So that's a huge step forward for our sport. My personal climbing story, will be the Olympics, hopefully. My personal climbing story begins in Gainesville, Florida, as I was finishing up the 8th grade in May of 2000. I went with some friends to a climbing gym that had just opened a few months earlier. My parents, who are here, right there, grew up mountaineering in Ukraine, so I always felt like climbing was in my blood. On that first day at the Gainesville Rock Gym, I got my first taste of what would become a lifelong obsession. My mom's coworker, Sean, also happened to be the coach of the youth climbing team, and he gave me a roll of green duct tape and told me to go set a route. So I taped a green 5/8 plus on the beginner's wall, and that sparked my 16-year love affair with route setting. The fact that I was urged to look at creating climbing movement critically from day one has greatly informed my development as a climber and a route setter. When I started doing this in high school, route setting was not a career option. It was something that kids did in exchange for a free gym membership. After college, I decided that the most satisfying challenge to overcome would not be to be average at something I didn't want to do, but to forge a career that had no existing blueprint. Yep, 16. So why am I here? I've never thought about what I do as game design before, but it's been really interesting to consider the interplay between my work and that of traditional programmers and designers. Many of the same soft skills necessary to excel at game design are also essential at route setting. Skills such as being imaginative and creative, being able to work on a team and take constructive criticism, being able to conceptualize movement in a 3D space, and then being able to translate that into code, or in our case, onto the climbing wall. And also to have a wide-ranging knowledge of and passion for the existing games on the market, in your case, and in our case, every climbing move that has ever been set, basically. The hard skills necessary for both game design and route setting are also quite varied. A good designer must have knowledge of programming languages and coding, as well as a familiarity with various game platforms and hardware with which each game is designed. Similarly, we as route setters must possess a wide range of handyman skills and ropes access techniques to be able to take our ideas and turn them into reality. So what I'd like to do is take the two types of setting and share what I've learned from each discipline and how they interface with each other. So commercial setting, think of it like a traditional single-player video game where users can test themselves against existing challenges, but their experience isn't altered by that of other players. In the commercial gym environment, we as route setters have several responsibilities to uphold toward our clientele. First and foremost, we want to make sure that the climbs we're putting on the wall are safe. Every setter's worst nightmare is having like a huge hold or feature ripping off the wall. And there used to be a really funny clip of that actually happening, and it's been erased from the internet somehow. But basically, I'll just describe it. It's a climbing competition, and this pro climber jumps to this volume that must be screwed onto the wall, like with only a couple screws, and he just rips it clean off the wall, and it falls on top of him. So this is like so mortifying because not only like is it so embarrassing that you forgot to put more screws in it, but also you probably hurt somebody. So that's first. Secondly, we want to create good flowing routes, and so that climbers will enjoy training on them and want to climb the same routes over and over again. Our gyms run on a membership-based business model, so keeping our hardcore climbers happy with consistent training routes is very important. My calling card in my commercial setting has always been to put eye-popping shapes and patterns on the wall. As is the case with real rock climbs, there's usually a direct correlation between how good a route is and how well it climbs, or how good a route looks and how well it climbs. This is just something that I set at a comp, but those are like a bunch of, it's like a nice flare of footholds, and it was actually super confusing for the climbers because they didn't know which ones to use, but that kind of stuff. Perhaps our most essential role at the gym is introducing newcomers to the basics of climbing and movement, and then helping them progress into actual climbers by peppering in new moves and techniques as they advance through the grades. Climbing is basically one long learning process. You can win a climbing competition, but you can't win at climbing. So our job is to educate climbers through setting moves and sequences that can only be done by learning certain advanced techniques. No matter how advanced the climber, there are always iterations of moves that they haven't encountered before. Even if climbers are initially frustrated by a tricky move that they can't figure out, they're more likely to come away with a deeper appreciation for the route, having learned something, rather than if it was given to them easily. One of the biggest debates today in climbing gyms is the ratio of basic training type routes, as seen here, and the more new school World Cup style or parkour style problems seen here. So one is much more basic and appeals to most users, whether they're just training or having fun. This is much more spectacular aesthetically and usually involves unorthodox movement. While this type of problem is usually very popular with gym rats, having too many of them can alienate our core customer base. Because most World Cup style boulders require huge features like this, having them greatly reduces the density of the other problems that are on the wall. So this is just a few photos of some other World Cup style problems in climbing gyms. We call those volumes. So people get really crazy with this stuff, as you can see. The truth is that a good gym will have a little of each extreme, but most climbs will be somewhere in between. They'll be interesting enough to engage the majority of climbers, but not so esoteric in their techniques to dissuade regular customers. This is kind of like a World Cup style problem that I set at one of our gyms. It kind of cuts off the first half second, but you kind of play. Okay. Want to show you guys a few more problems that are like that. There's a huge trend of this in Europe. We don't have a lot of this in the States yet, but they have a lot of gyms that are just designed to house this kind of movement. It's more of like a parkour gym, really. So as you can see, like the density of the problems on the wall is super thin. If there were like way more holds on the wall, people would be like hitting their elbows and their knees on stuff, so you can't really have both. This kind of movement requires like a ton of coordination. You kind of have to think like 3 steps ahead to figure out, you know, oh, my body's doing this, and then it's doing this, and then it's doing this. He's actually doing all this in sneakers, not even climbing shoes, so. I think he does it.
Ça sert à rien.
Nope, doesn't do it. Oh well. So I want to bring this around to setting for competitions. Commercial setting is what most of us have to do to pay the bills, but we really only get to set maybe 2 to 3 competitions a year. But those are kind of the most rewarding parts of our jobs, and we get to travel and go all over the place. So in the last few years, so competition setting is more akin to designing games like Call of Duty or Counter-Strike, I think, where the games have been created with a multiplayer competition element in mind, and things like online spectatorship are a big consideration. as Frank mentioned, in the last few years, I've been lucky enough to have set for a couple of these. I've set for US Bouldering Nationals twice, and then I got to set for IFSC World Cup. So every year there's roughly 8 Bouldering World Cups, and they kind of happen all over the world, but the US gets one every year. So that's kind of the one that we all try to apply for, and I was lucky enough to get it in 2015. So just for a little context, setting for an event like this usually takes about 4 days with a crew of 4 to 5 setters and a chief. We set the final round first, then semis, then qualifiers. After each round is set, we climb on the problems to get them within 90% of where we want them. Then we take them off the wall to make room for the next round of problems. Later, after each round of competition, we reassemble these problems using photos we've taken and marks on the wall. So it's a really involved process, and you're up late a lot of the time. So why can't the problems stay up from round to round? One of our greatest advantages as setters is that when the athletes come out, they've never seen these problems before. So any information that we glean from watching the competitors in the opening rounds, we then use to make tweaks and changes to the same problems that we've already set. So sometimes we'll have to climb on them again and figure out, oh, okay, we watched, the women climb on this, and they all did, this move really easily, and now we know we have a very similar move in the next round coming up. So now we have to reclimb the problems and be like, okay, how can we make it just a little bit harder so maybe, half of them fall off instead of all of them doing it. So the strategies behind setting for a national or international level bouldering competition are very different than any other type of setting. We have to consider the field that we're setting for. Are we setting for men? Are we setting for women? Are we setting for youth climbers? If so, what age category? How many competitors are there? What are the differences in height and reach between the shortest and tallest climbers? And what are we trying to find out about the field that we don't already know? So that can be, like, most of the time we know most of the competitors that are climbing and we're familiar with their strengths and weaknesses. So it comes down to I know that this guy is strong enough to do this move because he's really strong on small holds. So even though maybe when we're testing it out, we're not quite doing the move, but we know that this guy who's coming to the competition is strong enough to do it. So how hard do we want to set each round? There's typically 3 rounds of competition. Sometimes the chief setter will want to make qualifiers easy if the field's not very strong. And then other times, if the field is very strong, we want to make them really hard and weed people out. So what's the result that we're trying to achieve? The most important thing from a setting perspective is a clean breakdown of the results where there's a clean winner and no ties amongst the other finalists. So an ideal result would look something like first place completes all 4 problems. Usually there's 4. Second place would complete 3 problems. Third place would complete 2 problems, and so on. So that's like an ideal result. In addition to clean results, we want to make sure that we've tested the athletes fairly by giving them problems in a variety of styles and on different wall angles. So competition bouldering walls generally consist of 8 to 10 distinct wall sections with varying features and angles. The low angle walls, or slabs, generally allow for very slow technical movement. Vertical and gently overhanging walls are well suited for setting out-of-the-box sequences and party trick-like boulders, like the ones you saw in those earlier videos. Steep overhangs and roofs will mostly test the climber's pure power on moves that look to a non-climber just like monkeying around. So that's that same wall. It's the USA climbing comp wall. These varying wall angles are a starting point for route setters to test a climber's well-roundedness, but the ideas the setter then brings to the table complete the picture. No, not yet. So we also want to make sure that we test the competitor's climbing intelligence and decision-making in addition to their fitness. One tool we use for this is the RIC scale. So RIC stands for risk, intensity, and complexity. Risk encapsulates how low percentage and committing a move is. So maybe the move itself is not that hard, but maybe it's like a blind jump to a hold around a corner that you can't see. And so the competitor will hesitate and kind of not know where the hold is, even though, you know, when we're trying it, when we're forerunning, it doesn't feel that hard. So that's risk. Complexity accounts for how difficult it might be to, intensity. Intensity describes the pure difficulty of the move when done just right. So if the climber fully understands how to do it, this just describes just how purely difficult it is. And complexity accounts for how difficult it might be to figure out the easiest method for doing a problem in a limited amount of time, as is the case in competitions. So usually they only have 4 or 5 minutes to figure out the problem. So if it's exceptionally, like if they're just looking at the problem and they have no idea what to do, then it's really, really complex, and that's not great. So usually any one problem on the wall in the round will not rank all highly on all 3 measures. But collectively, the 4 or 5 problems should test those 3 factors more or less equally. So maybe one will just be really straightforward but really hard, and then another will be really, really tricky, and then another one will, they'll get to a certain place and they won't know what to do, but maybe it's not so bad. And this chart that a buddy of mine created kind of helps. This is like super nerdy stuff, but it kind of tracks, they've given like a number to each of those, or like an arrow. And then it also kind of describes what type of movement is on each problem, and that kind of helps you keep track of, okay, we set this kind of problem in qualifiers, so in semifinals, maybe we won't give them the same type of problem, or maybe we'll give that type of problem to the men instead of the women. So those are all the things that kind of go into making it feel like we've created a really comprehensive competition that tests them in all these different ways. So the last thing that we're trying to accomplish is that we want to put on a good show for the crowd. At the end of the day, these events are beholden to the sponsors, which help pay for them. So if we don't have good-looking problems that climb well on the wall, the media from the event won't be as valuable. The one thing that we're not worried about is what the athletes think of the problems. At the end of the day, like, people will form whatever opinion they want, but the result of the comp is what people will remember. And that's fundamentally different from what we do in the climbing gym scenario, like where that is exactly what we're worried about is, the climbers themselves enjoying themselves. So let's talk a little bit about the thought process that goes into constructing actual boulder problems. Because we're trying to control the outcome of each round, we must account for whether each problem in the round has one solution or multiple solutions. The fewer solutions each problem has, the easier it is to understand its difficulty and predict where and how often competitors will fall. Often, when we want to include problems with multiple solutions, climbers with a similar strength would then be separated by their decision making. So I have a couple examples of what that looks like. So these two Russian climbers are going to do this problem totally differently. So the guy on the left completely skipped the hold outright, which is actually a scoring hold, so that's super ballsy. He just, like, there's only 2 points of scoring. There's the one with the pink piece of tape and the one with the blue piece of tape. And he just completely avoided that and just went for the top. So, and so I thought this was cool because one of them is doing it facing the wall and the other one is doing it facing away from the wall. So problems like this are much more of a dice roll. What if all the climbers choose the path of most resistance and fail because the path of least resistance wasn't obvious enough? That's a pretty hard balance for us to strike. I don't know of any other sport where the outcome of a sporting event is so beholden to its organizers. There have been plenty of big competitions where there were big ties on the podium, or conversely, none of the athletes could do a single boulder problem. Sometimes we as route setters miss the mark, and that's a potential outcome that we have to be comfortable with when we step up to the plate at each event. Another piece of the puzzle for us is the differences in height and arm span within the field of competitors, and how those differences will influence the solutions to each problem. So for example, I set a comp last month where one of the competitors was 6'2" with a 6'8" arm span. So he was able to completely reach through a move that the other competitors all had to jump for. So these kinds of outliers are really hard to set for. Oops. So
Kyle, he just seems like he's getting better and bigger. He's 6'2" and has a +6, so that's a 6'8" wingspan. You know, you say, okay, well, I can't reach that at all. In reality, he has 8 more inches. For us, that's like pretty hard to fathom.
We about to burn it down.
Guys boulder, that's much more of a basic.
So, in general, I feel that route setting is viewed by many as mostly an art form, but to me, it's also equal parts math and science. For example, I can break down the difficulty of a move or sequence into the sum of the size of the handholds, the size of the footholds, the angle of the wall, and the distance between the holds. So this might seem kind of like a duh statement if you're familiar with climbing, but it's actually really helpful when you have a move that's either too hard or too easy, and you know that you can either improve or decrease one of these factors, and then you should be able to get the move that you want. So there's always multiple solutions to achieving the right difficulty. One of the most challenging parts of these events is being in touch with your own strengths and weaknesses as a climber, and understanding the difficulty of the problems that have been set. While most national level comp setters are themselves elite climbers, it can be very tough to gauge moves designed to challenge the world's best. There's, on the European circuit at least, there's a few guys that they're a few setters that they're so strong that sometimes when we're forerunning, they will do moves easily, and we have to be like, okay, we still have to make it easier, because a couple of these guys actually would stand to podium in these events if they were to compete instead of set. So not as much in America, but a lot of the guys on that circuit are also in their 40s and 50s, and they've been setting forever, and maybe they can't do the single hardest moves, but they're total wizards on like technical low angle terrain. These are a couple of those guys. There's stories of these really hard slab problems that none of the competitors in the competition could do, but then like one of these like crusty 50-year-old dudes just like walks up it when they're testing the problems out. When I set the World Cup in 2015, the biggest thing that I learned was that when it came to low risk, low complexity movement, that was just purely difficult. The top athletes were considerably stronger than me, which is kind of a duh statement, but usually I can either do each move or individually or almost do it to the point of where I can tell that it's possible. But there were just a bunch of moves that I couldn't even come close to doing, but they turned out to be like the right difficulty. And that was kind of like eye-opening to me, because in the US comps, like my understanding of difficulty is like really close. But at this event, it was kind of like, okay, like this is like a step up. So, oops. This was a move that I set for the men's final problem of that World Cup, where you grab your wrist and you don't have any feet, and it helps you pull through using only your arms to the next hold. So I was really proud of having set this move because I had never seen it set before in a competition. But at the end of the day, I think 6 of the 7 finalists ended up doing it. So this was that moment where I was like, oh man, like it kind of worked, which was cool, but it ended up being too easy because almost everybody did it. I think one thing that's always in the back of my mind when I'm setting these problems is to make sure that we're putting on a good show and that we give the athletes an opportunity to show off and fist pump and get hyped. I love putting them into positions where they're comfortable and they have time to become aware of the crowd and maybe show off their personalities. Because at the end of the day, that's what sponsors and people want to see in these highlight reels is, you know, athletes being like, yeah, this is awesome. Just like with skateboarding tricks, route setters are always trying to one-up each other by trying to set crazier and crazier moves and combinations of moves. Right now I think everyone is trying to see how many hand moves they can force in one continuous move. So this is from World Championships, which happened just a month ago. This is basically the biggest event that ever happens. Like there's World Cups every year, but World Championships only happens every 2 years. So this was a finals problem from from that event.
Goes for that block.
Exactly, and it is 4+, correct? So they can at least get on the wall with the last minute.
Oh, this time sticks it.
Wow.
Oops, shit. Ah. Sorry. Well, that was the part of that I wanted to show. What he did there was 4 hand moves in a row. He went 1, 2, 3, and then he stopped himself with 4. So that's kind of where it's maxed out right now is 4. I tried to set a 5-move sequence at that same event from like 2 videos ago. So I'll kind of show you how I wanted people to do it. So this was during forerunning. Forerunning is what we call it when we are testing the problems out. So what I was trying to do there is I wanted you to go, so you start moving and then there's a feature that's sticking out from the wall, but it's not so good that you can just go hands-free. What's going on is you're slowly starting to fall away from the wall, but you have these holds that are kind of helping you get somewhere. So I was trying to go 1, 2, and then go around the corner 3, 4, and then you're kind of what we call barn dooring off, and then there's a 5, and then you catch 5 and fall down. So that's like really, really ambitious, and I figured it probably wouldn't go. My hope was that one of the 6 finalists would do it that way, and none of them did it that way. But I'll show you what. So this is how they, or for some reason they only, I'll just rewind a little bit. For some reason they only showed one person on that sequence, which is kind of a bummer, but he basically like went super slow and didn't do it how I wanted. But the rest of the problem is still super exciting and people didn't really notice, so yeah, this kid crushed the comp and did all the problems really easily. So to me, one of the most interesting parts of route setting is the need to visualize the movement without actually doing it. I'm doing this all day, every day, whether it's I'm setting for a competition or if I'm in the gym. You can't have your climbing shoes on all day because they're really tight and they hurt when you wear them. So you kind of have to look down at your feet and see, oh, okay, I have a foothold here. That means I can reach this far, but only to a hold that's facing this direction, and then it must be this good, so on and so forth. So if it feels like what I would imagine designing virtual reality to be like, you have total awareness of your surroundings and how your body is likely to interact with its environment. I think this is the part of route setting that's the hardest to teach to new setters. If your brain hasn't spent all those hours formulating the schema to know those minute differences, trial and error is kind of the only solution. So just start wrapping things up a little bit. I thought I'd share a few tricks of the trade with you guys. Back to this photo. So there's a bunch of little small things that we do in the setting world that, or in the comp setting world that we don't normally do for commercial setting. One thing is sanding holds down. So we'll actually take sandpaper and we'll kind of, there's good friction on most climbing holds. They're made out of urethane, so if you sand them down a little bit, they lose that friction. And actually, that move, the handcuff move, we sanded, it was a 2-finger pocket, so you know, only have 2 fingers in it. And the reason for that is actually so that you can't swap hands on it, because if it's a small hole like this and you only have 2 fingers, you can't really just like do this. But we also sanded down the outside of the pocket so that there was absolutely nothing you could do to grab it. And we do that to like specifically try to force the move that we want. Another thing that, this is pretty rare, but sometimes we fill parts of holds with putty. And actually, my colleague that I was setting this competition with, this hold that his right hand is on, if you can see, the rest of these holds have bolt holes. So the hold's attached to the wall with, you know, a big steel bolt. And sometimes you can put your thumb inside of that bolt hole and it kind of adds to the grip of the hold, so it makes it easier to hold on to it. And here what we did, my colleague filled in the bolt hole with putty, and then somehow, and I never found out where he got it from, he somehow managed to paint it the exact color of the hold. So it was like seamless and there was no bolt hole. So normally you'd be able to like match that comfortably kind of and put your thumb in there, but now you couldn't do that. Sometimes we have special holds that are poured specifically for a competition. These shallow pour holds are made by taking a regular silicone hold mold and only partially pouring it with the urethane, so instead of the whole way. So this produces a climbing hold that looks very much like a hold that competitors are used to training on, because all these holds are readily available at most climbing gyms. So it looks like a hold that they're familiar with, but when they go to grab that hold, it's actually substantially worse than the original hold. So the opposite effect can also be achieved by taking a hold mold and bending it so that a part of it, the hold, is better than it traditionally is. And then one other fun thing that we do is esoteric finish positions. So if you go to a regular climbing gym, most problems will just end at the top of the wall on what we call a jug, so like a really big hold that's easy to hang on to. But in competitions, you have to end by matching a finish hold, so having both hands on a finish hold. So that you normally wouldn't ever, like if you're just climbing something from point A to point B, you wouldn't have to stop and do it any specific way. But with finish holds, that's the one time where we have to make them put, you know, both hands on one hold. And I've got one last video that I'm just gonna let roll, but there's actually an example of that in the video. So, just to wrap things up, so this is actually a video from that World Cup that I set for, and it's kind of a slow motion thing. So, just to wrap up, other than just sharing my story with you guys, I guess my contributing piece to the game design puzzle would be to always make things as aesthetically pleasing as possible, but not at the cost of functionality. Keep the big picture in mind. Don't get hung up on the minutia of any one aspect of the experience that you're curating, as long as the game as a whole works and feels balanced. Always have a team first mentality. Once we put the problems on the wall, we relinquish total control over them to the rest of the crew, and we have to be okay with our work being scrutinized and changed for the good of the goal that we're working towards. And finally, inspire the player with a formidable challenge that beckons them to rise to the occasion. Give them something that intrigues them that they've never seen before, and be willing to take big swings and miss. And ultimately strive to have them walk up to a stranger one day and say, "Hey, do you know how to do that one?" So I'll let this play, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Max. That was amazing. Why don't you grab the mic that's tucked in behind that side of the thing, and we will. I'm gonna. Yeah, there should be one on the stand back there. Is that okay? And please come and have a seat. That was spectacular. One of the things that I kept thinking about was the origins of climbing out in the world, right? And the relationship between mountains and rocks and boulders.
Sure.
You know, when you think of rock climbing, you think so much of like going out into nature and discovering a thing and looking at it and then decide. And then these, they're so weird and interesting and beautiful and kind of artificial looking.
Yes.
And I guess my question is, what's the relationship there? Is there any, is there a thread there? And do you think of what you're doing in relationship to like nature, or is it just, has it mutated into this totally new realm?
Yeah, so that kind of goes along with, like I was talking about the difference between World Cup style boulders and the normal boulders that we put on the wall. Yeah, traditional climbing, you're not going to find a lot of movement like all this, like the crazy jumping parkour stuff. And there's kind of this big debate in the climbing community. You know, do we want to have these gyms that just simulate, you know, real rock climbing where the movement is generally really basic? Like you can definitely find, and I didn't include any footage of real climbing, but you know, almost any move that you can think up will exist somewhere in the world on a real climb. But generally, it's much more basic movement. So, you know, our inspiration ultimately comes from climbing on rock. Most of us, almost all route setters are, you know, first rock climbers and then route setters. So, you know, one's will never exist without the other, but there's been this widening divide between the type of movement that you're finding indoors and outdoors.
So when you talk about like an unorthodox move, is it what's an example? Is it something that involves, I don't know, like changing your orientation, so you go from facing the wall to flipping around to the other? Like what's an example of like a you know, weird or unorthodox move? So
I guess the easiest example is what we call a jump. It's called a dyno. So dynos are rare, like it's much less frequent to find them on real rock because it basically means, you know, there's a good feature and then there's a large stretch of wall where there are no other features, but then there's another hold, right? And just in general, that's harder to find. It exists, but so then these what we call triple jumps or paddle dynos, what you kind of saw where it was like one hand movement, two hand movement, three hand movements all in one. Those are really, really hard to find on real rock, but they do exist. We were in South Africa this summer and bouldering, and there was a triple jump on real rock that was really insanely hard, and I couldn't come anywhere close to doing it, but they exist. But so all inspiration does come from the natural world.
In climbing, as I understand it, as an outsider, there's a kind of numerical precision for difficulty, right, for a climb. Does that translate to the gym and to competitions? Do you use a similar kind of, you know, the similar scale?
It does. So and we've predominantly talked about bouldering today because that's most of the events that I set for are bouldering comps. There's also route comps, and those two use different grading scales. But for bouldering events, boulder problems have a grade assigned to them by the first person that climbs them. And, those are basically opinion-based. And then once a lot of people have climbed that problem, they give their own opinion of the grade, and usually it kind of averages out. And also, there's actually a formula that I created in 2009 or something. I broke my leg, and I had a lot of time to sit on the couch and think about just climbing because I'm a nerd. But you can actually break down the difficulty of a boulder problem into the difficulty of each move. So if you know, okay, like this is a V7 sequence and then you do a V9 move, the whole problem will be graded V10. So there's a formula to it. I don't have it like here off the top of my head, but yeah, you can actually break it down to that level. But then that doesn't really account for, okay, well, this guy is 6'2", and he, for him this move is like, that was really, really easy for him because he didn't have to do the coordination part of it. He could just, reach, basically.
Yeah.
So that's where it kind of breaks down.
Yeah. When you're designing a problem, do you always start with a vision of what you're trying to accomplish, or do you sometimes just trial and error and you just like throw a bunch of junk on the wall and see if something emerges?
Sure. Yeah, we do it that way. Every problem is different. At a regular day of work, I'll probably set anywhere from 5 to 7 boulder problems, and anywhere from really hard to mostly on the easier end. And every time I try to draw an inspiration from something else, but it's always there's some aesthetic thing going on there with the type of holds that I pick out. So it's very rare that it's movement based. It's always like I start with the holds. When I'm setting for competition, it usually is movement based. Like I'll have thought of these moves in advance and want to put them on the wall. But just day to day, it's usually like, oh, I like this hold, and these other holds kind of look like it, and so I'll use all these. And then basically you have to, I'll set a move, and then from there on, like every other move that I can think of is there, and the next natural one that just pops into my mind is kind of the one that I choose.
Interesting.
I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain.
Cool. That's cool. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
For the commercial setting, how do you think about the flow of a single problem in terms of difficulty over time as they do the climb?
Yeah, so obviously the length of the boulder problem or the route comes into factor of the difficulty. With boulder problems, they're generally pretty short. They can be anywhere from one move to, just because the wall doesn't get too high, it's hard to make a boulder problem that's longer than like 15 or 16 moves. Otherwise, you just get like a long traverse. So for boulder problems, the length of it has less to do with the difficulty, because when you're doing fewer moves, you just get less tired, right? But then routes can be anywhere from 25 feet to 200 feet if you have a rope that's long enough. And then it kind of, but then there's also like, oh, maybe there's like a no hands rest, halfway up the route, and then you're able to recover fully and then keep climbing. So all of those things kind of go into deciding the difficulty.
Cool. Yeah.
You talked about considering people's sizes and weight for competitions, but how difficult is that to do in a commercial setting? It could be like kids or anyone.
Right.
So how difficult?
Yeah. So I always tell the people that I work with to set for the top of the bell curve. So for us, that means I'd say 90% of our customers, maybe like 85, are between 5 foot tall and 6 foot tall. So some setters will be like, well, I have a low foot here for the tall person, and I have a really high foot here for the short person. But actually what that does is it makes it uncomfortable for like 85% of the people trying it, because they're like either like this or they're like this, right? So we try to put the feet kind of in between, and then, you know, the people that are on the outside of that bell curve usually will, you know, find a way to do it. But yeah, that's kind of, you know, it's definitely, we don't have to worry about like, oh, some guy's going to reach through this move, because, you know, it doesn't really matter. Like, we don't care. You know, they're just people having fun. Does that help?
Yeah. All the way in the back?
So design's all about anticipation, and you explained like how much you have to anticipate, the person that's climbing, what's the score can be, and all that. Have you ever set a route and then see someone solve that route in some totally unexpected way? And if so, like, how do you feel? Like, did you feel like that? Oh, I should probably like rethink the way I think of how I set that route, or was it just something just delightful?
So the question is, yeah, has anyone ever sent a problem of yours in a way that you totally didn't expect or anticipate, and how did that make you feel?
It can be delightful, yeah, for sure. It can also be extremely frustrating. And again, it depends on the context. So in a climbing gym, you know, unless it's something super specific where I was like, I really wanted them to do it this way, like maybe I'll go back and change it. But, you know, in a competition setting, you can't just like go back and change it because it's already done. And yeah, like, and it also depends. So, you know, if you have it set this one way, and then, you know, all 6 finalists come and they just do it this other way that you didn't expect, that's really frustrating, because, you know, you just totally missed the mark. And but at the same time, like, if they did it a really cool way that the audience really liked, you know, maybe that's okay. But it kind of comes down to, you know, did the result of the comp, was it hindered or was it made better by the fact that they didn't do it the way that I wanted them to do it?
Robin?
I have a question about the teamwork aspect of setting routes, especially for a competition.
Sure.
As you're starting to set a route, do you find that someone in the group naturally tends to take the lead for a particular problem? How do you kind of negotiate that intent?
Yeah.
And then drive the route? You know, I've definitely climbed things where one person is taking credit for it, but it often feels like
Mhm.
there's a little bit something more than the sum of the parts that comes from team set routes.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the question is about teamwork and collaboration on routes,
Sure.
and how does that work?
So in the commercial environment, we pretty much always, you know, one setter will set one route, and then at the end of the day, we usually have 2 or 3 people if it's a route, and maybe more of us if it's a boulder problem. We all climb the routes, and then we give each other feedback, and the senior members of the team will kind of, you know, take the lead on that. But yeah, in the comp environment, it's very different. Traditionally, we do get assigned a boulder problem, but then there's also plenty of times where, you know, the whole team will set it, or maybe one person will come through and they'll put a bunch of features on the wall, and then somebody else will come in afterwards and kind of figure out the movement. It's much more free flowing. And that's kind of like the funnest part of route setting, and specifically for competitions to me is, you know, a lot of the people that I work with in the commercial environment, they don't necessarily have like the same passion and same vision, because, you know, they just mostly do it in the gym. But when you go to these events, everybody there is like a super nerd, and they're like, you know, they really understand the movement. So, you know, there's tons of times where I just get stumped with what I'm setting and I can't, you know, figure it out. And then you just call somebody else over, and, you know, it's like, what am I doing here? Like, what am I trying to achieve? And, you know, it's super helpful to have like a pair of fresh eyes.
Okay, I think we're going to have time for maybe just 2 more. So, Vi, why don't we go there, and then we'll go here.
Do routes or problems ever go viral, or like get a name and the gym will set up the same one everywhere because everyone loves it so much?
Yeah, so just for the cameras, the question is, yeah, do routes ever like go viral and get a name and then become famous for a particular gym?
Yeah, they absolutely do. People will often try to replicate, moves that they see online or on rock. It's very hard to completely replicate it just as it was set because each climbing gym is built independently, so you will not necessarily have the same wall angles and the same features to be able to use. There's actually there's this training wall that you can just buy and build, and it's set to a very specific angle, and the T-nuts are all the same. They're standardized, and the hold alignment is also standardized, and it's a bunch of just really small holds. And then climbers will share problems that they've made up, and then everyone can have the same experience because they just basically put up a map and they're like, I use this hold, this hold, this hold, and this hold, and now anyone who has that wall, it's called a moon board after the guy who designed it, they can all try those. But people definitely like name moves. There's boulder problems on real rock, they have names, like the first ascensionist gives them a name. So we always joke about there's a boulder problem called the understanding and there's the understanding move, which is basically you jump to a hold that's facing sideways, and then your arm has to let go, and then the only thing you can do to stop your momentum is kick the wall. And if you don't kick the wall, you fall off. So we call that the understanding move. That's just an example.
So cool. Okay, last question.
You talked a little bit about a scoring hold at one point, and we also saw in one of the videos there was a timer going.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's going to be an Olympic sport soon, it sounds like. So Olympic scoring is super granular because of the level of mastery.
Yes.
So I was kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about what methods you use to rate a player's performance and how employing those methods influences the design of your.
Great. So the question is about scoring. Is there timing and hold moves, and how do you differentiate in a fine-grained way between climbs?
So there's a lot to unpack here. For starters, the Olympics, it only got accepted as a combination of all three climbing disciplines. So that's bouldering, sport climbing, and speed climbing, which I didn't even talk about. But speed climbing is just a standardized wall with the same route, and you just see how fast you can get up it. So for the Olympics, unfortunately, they were only able to give us one medal. So what we want is a bouldering medal, a sport climbing medal, and a speed climbing medal, because they are extremely different, and people specialize in one or the other. There's maybe a few world-class climbers that take part in all three, but so for bouldering, there's also like a huge debate about what the best scoring system is, and the IFSC, like the global governing body, they have their scoring system, and that's basically like you only get scored for either getting to one of the holds that's marked with one piece of tape, or getting to the top. And then after that, it's how many tries did it take you to get that far. So it's really basic and really easy to keep track of, but it doesn't take into account a lot of other factors. So in the USA Climbing actually kind of changes their rules like every year almost, it seems, because they can't figure out which scoring system is best. And initially it was just, okay, like either you get to the top or they count the total number of holds in the sequence, and there's like a route map. You like take a photo of it and you say, okay, this is hold 1, hold 2, hold 3, hold 4, hold 5, and this climber got to hold 4, this climber got to hold 7, and this climber got to the top. What that doesn't account for is basically, the moves between 4 and 7 were all really easy, but on this other problem, every move is really hard, so it's rewarding people for doing easier moves. So the system that they've settled on for this season is kind of similar to the IFSC system, but there's
3 strips of tape on the wall and then a top. So and as the route setter, we get to decide which holds we want to put those strips of tape on to score. So we can actually like influence where the climber has to go by putting suggestive, scoring on the wall. Be like, okay, like we want you to go over here, even though it seems like maybe you can just skip and go over here. So that's the one thing that, climbing doesn't have going for it, is that it's hard to understand scoring for a lot of people that aren't familiar with it. So,
Will you be going to the Olympics? Are you
I hope.
Are you shooting for that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's my dream for sure.
Where can people go to see more of your work and see videos of stuff you've been involved in? Do you have like an online thing? Twitter or
we're kind of starting a consulting company for route setting. My girlfriend Clara and I.
Right.
So
what's it called?
It's called Building Blocks. So we don't have a website yet, but we will like in a few weeks.
Excellent.
So you guys
fantastic. We will look out for
Building Blocks with a C.
Okay. Building Blocks USA.
Yeah.
All right. We will look for it.
Great.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.